Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Parsha and Halacha share. Thank you, as always, so much for joining. I followed the normal format in which I've muted everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask anything. And we'll also stick to the usual format of half an hour on the Parsha, followed by half an hour on Halacha, in which we'll continue to look at the Melacha of Bishul on Shabbos. Cooking on Shabbos, and I think we're up to leaving food on before Shabbos, in which halachas apply. But let's first of all start with the Sedra. For those who didn't manage to see the source sheet, I'll post it in the chat. So I'll put a link there. If anyone hasn't yet managed to download the source sheet, you should be able to just click on the link and see the source sheet. And I wanted to look at the story of the Meraglim, and a fascinating philosophical discussion that emerges from the story. Now, one of the primary difficulties of the story, there's many difficulties in the story, but one of the primary difficulties in the story is why exactly did Hashem or Moshe decide to send Meraglim? What was the point of sending these spies to spy out the land? After all, was it not setting them up for failure? I mean, if the criticism of them is when they return, they provide a report about Eretz Yisrael, why was that ever necessary in the first place? Hashem has told them they should go to Eretz Yisrael. He's told them it's a good land. He's told them he's going to help them conquer it. What is the purpose of their mission? Aside from the fact that, of course, when they return, they libel Eretz Yisrael, and perhaps they also express disbelief in the ability of the Jewish people to conquer it. But what's the purpose of the mission in the first place? Now, part of the difficulty is that there's somewhat of a contradiction between the two times the story is told to us. The story is told to us in this week's Sedra, in the 13th chapter of Bamidbar, and the story is repeated in Sefer Devarim when Moshe spoke to the Jewish people and reminded them of many of their experiences throughout their sojourn in the desert. And in that version of events, there's subtle differences as to what exactly happened. Now, it's beyond the scope of this shir to discuss why is it that when Moshe informed the Jewish people of various historic events in Sefer Devarim, or retaught them mitzvahs, reminded them, did chazorah, a revision on mitzvahs, why he on occasion subtly altered the text, subtly altered what happened. We're very familiar with this idea. Chazal address it a lot. There's constant little tweaks and changes and differences between how Moshe recites the history of the Jewish people and how the Torah in the first four books recites them. How Moshe talks about the mitzvahs or the averos, and how the Torah talks about them. And I've discussed this on other occasions, both in the context of my series on biblical criticism and in the context of understanding what Sefer Devarim is, how it is Moshe's recital of events, how Moshe adds a certain slant and detail to it, which may perhaps be different to how the Torah the first time presents it. But be that as it may, the two stories have to be consistent. They can have different angles and nuances to them, but the broad parameters of the story obviously have to be consistent. Now, if we look at the top of page 1 in the handout, this is, for those who have Chumosha in front of them, right at the beginning of the Sedra. Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe le'imar, Hashem spoke to Moshe, Shelach l'chanoshim, send out people, v'yosuras eretz Canaan, they'll scout out the land of Canaan, and that is their mission. So as far as Shelach Lecha is concerned, it's an instruction from Hashem. We then turn to Devarim, chapter 1, Pasuk 19, and Moshe says, Vanissa michorev v'neilech es kol hamidbar hagadol v'hanorahu. We journeyed from Chorev and began traveling through the desert. Now, for those of you who remember last week, etc., this is basically a summary of Baloscha. We finally leave Har Sinai and we begin traveling through the desert. And we arrive at the border of Eretz Yisrael. And now we start Shelach Lecha. So Moshe says to the Jewish people, V'omar leichem, Pasuk 20 in the source sheet. Again, for those who don't have the handout, I'll post it in the side. Pasuk 20 in Devarim chapter 1. I said to you, we've arrived at the border. Here's the land which is ours, which Hashem has promised us, and we're going to go and conquer it. And now we get to the crucial pasuk. Vatikru v'nelai kulchem, and all of you drew near to me. Let us send men ahead of us, so that they can explore the land. That they can tell us about the land and the route which we shall go up to it, and how we should enter it. It says Moshe in Pasuk 23, it was good in my eyes, and I took 12 people, 12 men, to be the Meraglim. So in brief, in Bamidbar chapter 13, our Parsha, Hashem is the active party. He says, send Meraglim, and Moshe is the passive one who receives the commandment. In Devarim, the actors are not Hashem, but two other parties, Moshe and the Jewish people. The Jewish people initiate it, and Moshe accepts the suggestion. Now, in some shape or form, the answer to the question is evidently that there's a lengthier conversation going on, in which perhaps the people request it, Moshe acquiesces, and then Hashem instructs it, or something of the sort. And there's different angles amongst the Mefarshim about exactly how to put these together. At the top of the source sheet on the pasuk of our Sedra, the beginning of the Shelach Lecha, I printed Rashi. Rashi really is quoting the Medrash Tanchuma, and Rashi says, "Send for yourself, Shelach Lecha l'datcha." In your own opinion, I'm not telling you to do this. If you wish to, you can send. So Rashi picks up on the language of the pasuk. This isn't a straight out instruction from Hashem. You have to send, but Shelach Lecha, send for yourself, send for your own sake. Meaning, if that's what you wish to do, then you can do it. And then Rashi continues, and he mentions the contradiction. The future boy Yisrael v'Omru, he now quotes from Devarim, Nishlach ha'anoshim lefanenu, we want to send, etc. And Moshe was okay with it. He consulted with Hashem, and Hashem said, you can do so if you wish. So Rashi here is interpreting Shelach Lecha not to be an instruction, but permission, because the true originators of the requests were the Jewish people and the acquiescence of Moshe. I don't think Rashi is necessarily saying that the expression Shelach Lecha has to mean that. For example, when Avraham is told Lech Lecha, it doesn't mean you can choose whether you wish to go to the land of Israel or not. It's an instruction. You should go. Lech Lecha, Rashi says, means for your sake. You will gain benefit from going to the land of Israel. However, you have to do so. So when Rashi says Shelach Lecha means you can choose to do so, I don't think he's saying that that's the only way to interpret it. He's saying it's a reasonable interpretation, because the Lecha, Shelach Lecha, indicates for your sake. So go for your own sake, send these spies for your own sake. And therefore Rashi adds in, that means to say, in this context at least, I'm not commanding it, I'm giving permission. So this is how Rashi resolves the order of events in the instruction to send. Now, what was the mission and what happens in the end? What was the purpose of the mission and what actually did the spies do? So there's two approaches to addressing this issue, and they are quite contrasting approaches. They're quite different approaches in mindset. The first approach, in a non-historical order, we're going to look at two approaches. We're going to look at the approach of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who is a Rishon who lives in Spain in the medieval era. And we're going to look at the approach of the Malbim, Rebbe Meir Yehuda Leib, who lives in the middle of the 1800s, from 1809 to 1879, something like that, and flourished really in the 1840s and 50s and 60s. And we're going to look at their two approaches to how they address what exactly the mission of the Meraglim was meant to be, given our introduction that this is perhaps somewhat of a lukewarm acquiescence of Hashem rather than an absolute mitzvah. And what's interesting is that their approaches are really, in many respects, opposite approaches. And I'll first share the angle of the Malbim outside. We won't look at it inside. And then we'll try and look at the Ramban's approach and understand what he's saying. And the Malbim argues that when we talk about the Meraglim, the spies, we are, in English at least, referring to spies or scouts, conflating two very different sorts of missions. There is a mission of scouting or exploring, which is referred to in Hebrew as lotor, tof vov reish, which means to tour. In modern Hebrew, tayarut means tourism, lotor means to tour. It's literally to tour, T-O-U-R, to be a tourist, to tour around. And when Moshe sends the spies, he actually doesn't call them spies. There's no word meraglim at this point. He tells them their mission is V'yaturu, you should tour, latur, you should go and explore and scout out the land. In other words, they're not being sent as spies to, on a military level, work out how to conquer Eretz Yisrael, but they're being spent as scouts to, or surveyors to tour and survey the lands and come back to us with a report of what sort of land this is. The second sort of spies are indeed meraglim. These are secret agents, spies, whose job is to investigate a proper systematic military analysis of the land and understand its fortifications and its strong points and its weak points, and come up with a strategy as to how we can conquer it. Now, these are two very different missions that demand very different sorts of people and behave in a very different sort of way. And in fact, we have both these missions in the Torah, because in the Haftorah of the Sedra that we read in Shelach Lecha, we read about spies, meraglim, and there the word used is, the words used are meraglim, and these are sent by Yehoshua after the death of Moshe, indeed to be spies. But note the differences between the missions. When they are sent to be meraglim. The Hebrew word used is meraglim, to be spies. And they are only two of them. They're not a whole team. You don't send undercover operation 12 people. You don't insist that these 12 people are representatives of 12 tribes, because you don't need 12 people. It will draw attention to itself. You definitely don't need representatives of each tribe. Why should there be representatives of each tribe? They're not even named, because the whole way meraglim operate is undercover. They're not distinguished dignitaries. You don't send dignitaries to be your spies. You send spies to be your spies. They're anonymous. They're not named, and they're not famed for being leaders of the 12 tribes. So when you're sending meraglim, says the Malbim, that looks like Sefer Yeshua. When you're sending spies, it's two people, not the whole team of them. They're not Nasiim, they're not princes, they're not leaders. Of course you don't send leaders. They're not named, they're anonymous. And they just go quietly and they do their investigation, and then they come back and they report. They're not representatives of leadership in any way at all. In our Sefer, it's a completely different mission. It's 12 people being sent, representatives of each tribe. They're Nasiim, they're leaders, they're prominent individuals. They're fulfilling a leadership role. They're the tribal representatives, and they're named. They're a large part. We're not going to go into this too much in this year. A significant part of the beginning of Shelach Lecha is listing the names of these people, and it's specified again and again that these people are noshim. These are leaders, distinguished people, each one with their own name, each person with their own name. They're fulfilling a mission of representing the Jewish people. What way are they representing the Jewish people? To perform the task of exploring and surveying. Each tribe sends out a representative to see which part of the land is suitable, how it can be divided up, what it's good for. We know eventually in the division of Eretz Yisrael, each tribe adopts a different mission, dwells in a different part of the geography, and forms a tribal identity around that. So Zevulun find themselves a coastal plain because they're a seafaring folk. They want to go and travel in the seas. Yehuda is involved in grape growing and looks for fertile lands in the hills, which are Yehuda and Hebron, which are places to grow wine. Osher is interested in olive oil, in oil production, in olive production, and each tribe has its own interests, and therefore they send representatives to represent the interests of the tribe. Leadership figures are noshim, princes, who are there to tour Eretz Yisrael and come back and report what the geography is, so that the people can begin thinking about what's the nature of this land. Hashem has told us it's a good land, but what's its nature? What's its geographical features? What's its mineral reserves? What's its farming features? Where are the powerful cities? Where are the weak cities? What are the agricultural and open cities? This isn't about military prowess, but this is about understanding the land. And Hashem has told them this is a good land, but now they want to know more details. In the Melbourne's thinking, nothing inherently wrong with that whatsoever. However, what happens in the end? In the end, they subvert their mission. They change their mission. It is true that they start off being Lotor, but in the end, they shift into military experts, and they come back with a military report about whether it can be conquered or not. When does this shift happen? Says the Malbim very beautifully, the shift happens if we analyze the psukim in Devarim, when they enter into Nachal Eshkol. Have a look at the bottom of page 1, the continuation of the psukim in Devarim. And they turned and they went up to the mountain, Pasuk Chavdalid, Pasuk 24, the second last Pasuk on the page. Vayifnu vayalu hara, vayavow ad Nachal Eshkol. They went to Nachal Eshkol, vayiraglu osar, and there they spy it. and they take from the fruit of the land. And they come back and they say, the land is good. In other words, their report about their tourist visit, Lotur, their tour of the land of Israel, is it's a good land. But at some point, they become meraglim. Where do they become meraglim? In Nachal Eshkol. But what happens in Nachal Eshkol? Well, we can have a look. Have a look at the top of page 2, where we continue chapter 13 in Al Sedra, in which we see the description of their exploration of Eretz Israel. Vayishlach Moshe, Moshe sent them, the top of page 2 in the source sheet. What's Moshe's mission? Losores Eretz Canaan, to tour, as we said. See the land, the people that dwell in it. Where is it a strong place? Where is it a weak place? Where it's good? What's more useful for this? What's less useful for that? Which is the fat part of the land? Which is the lean part of the land, etc. And bring back fruit as part of your survey. But what do? They go up, and then suddenly it goes wrong. In Pasuk 27, they see Hebron, they see the Anokim, they see the Yelidei HaAnok, the fearful and giant race that lives there, very powerful people. And then they arrive in the valley of Eshkol, they arrive in Nachal Eshkol, as we've read already. And what do they see in Nachal Eshkol? They see there the massive fruits. They've seen now the giant people, the fearful nation, they've seen the fruit. And this is the trigger that changes them from being spies, lotor, from being surveyors, to being meraglim, according to the thinking of the Malbim. At this point, they become overwhelmed. They see the giant fruit, they see the fearful and giant people that live in the land, and they suddenly say, it's true, we were sent here as lotor, as surveyors, but we see we have to act as meraglim. There's no way we can conquer this. This is absolutely frightening. We're being led into a military trap, into a disaster. We have a duty, we have an obligation to warn the people that this isn't going to end well. This is going to be a military defeat. So this is the Malbim's reading of Psukim, which is very, very well into the nuances of the language and the difference between the mission statements in Yehoshua, where they are indeed meraglim, as opposed to now Sedra, where their job is representatives of the people, leaders, surveyors of the future land of Israel. They're sent to be surveyors, and they end up as military strategists, as meraglim, as spies. So says the Malbim. The Ramban, Nachmanides, takes a very different approach to this. And the Ramban says, no, they're certainly sent to explore the military possibility of conquest of the land of Israel, of the land of Canaan. And the truth is, in the Psukim, it's open to interpretation either way. When Moshe says, see the people if they're strong or weak, when he says, see what the open cities are and the fortified cities, he could mean, as per the Malbim, that it's simply trying to understand the land, where the big commercial centers are, where are the walled cities, where are the open cities, where is it a healthy part of the climate, where is it a less healthy part of the climate. This is all part of their survey. But the Ramban doesn't understand it like that. The Ramban says certainly they are being sent for military reasons. And he says this is the correct thing to do. It is true, perhaps, as Rashi says, that they're not commanded to do it. Though the Ramban questions whether this is a good reading of Shelach Lecha, it seems like they are commanded to do. But if indeed, as per Rashi, Hashem acquiesces reluctantly and really this isn't the right thing to do, then it turns out that a significant part of the events of the Meraglim is the sin of Moshe. Who asked Moshe to send these spies? Why did they send the spies? And indeed, why did Yeshua later send spies if this was such a terrible thing to do? Says the Ramban, evidently there's nothing wrong with sending spies. Why would there be nothing wrong with sending spies? What do you need spies for? Surely Hashem has committed, has promised, that this is a land that they will be able to conquer with the help of Hashem. And the Ramban answers this question, and I printed the Ramban here at length. We're not going to have time to go through all of it, but it's a beautiful Ramban to read. He says this is part of a general pattern, a general insight into how HaKadosh Baruch Hu operates. Let's have a look at the third paragraph in the Ramban, near the final paragraph on the bottom of page 2. Aval Yishuv Inyan Bezer, the resolution of this whole matter is Kisrael Omru Kaderach Kolabayim Lenochim Ba'aretz Nochria. Any nation would say this if they're going to fight in a strange land. Shesholchim V'neim Anoshim, you send ahead of them people. Lodasa Derachim, to know the paths, or Mavo Ha'orim, and the ways into the cities. Uvashuvam, And on their way back, Yelcha Torim, the scouts, will go Barosh Atzava in front of the army, Lahoris Lifnei Madrachim, to direct them how to go in. This is natural. This is absolutely how you conquer a land. You send scouts ahead whose mission is to tell you how to get in, and then they go ahead of the army in order to direct them. And then he carries on in the last line of the page. This is how all conquerors of land behave. This is Eitz HaHogun. This is a perfectly reasonable behavior. Moshe himself did that. Yeshua, we find Yeshua did that. It's absolutely reasonable to do so. The penultimate line. This is the reason this was good in the eyes of Moshe. Because it's not appropriate to rely in all circumstances, in everything one does, on a nace, on a miracle. So here the Ramban is saying a general theme, which he develops in many places in the Torah, that it is not always an ideal way of behaving to rely on a nace. Ramban says this is a general rule, that the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu wishes to interface, to interact with the world, is to be mamayet benisim, to reduce miracles. And Ramban discusses this in many contexts, in many scenarios. For example, he develops a whole understanding of the story of Noach and why Noach had to build the teva to rescue himself and rescue the animals. I mean, the whole thing is miraculous anyway. The flooding of the whole world, the whole globe, is just the only way that Noach could be saved. Even once he was in the teva, was this really a viable vehicle to save him? Could all the animals fit in? Could all the food supplies fit in? Could it stand up to the flood? And he says this is a general rule, l'mayet hanes, in order to reduce the miracle. Needless, unnecessary squandering of miracles, doing miracles just needlessly, in a needlessly flamboyant manner, this isn't the way of Hashem operating. Now, this is an important and fascinating idea, because here we have it coming from the Ramban, who is one of the foremost exponents of the mystical and Kabbalistic approach to interpreting the Torah, and certainly not a Maimonidean rationalist. We've discussed in previous occasions the view of the Rambam, who believes that the normal operation of the world should avoid that of miracles, and we've discussed why the Ramban is of this opinion. It's not an idea I'm going to go into in the context of today's share. But interestingly and fascinatingly, the Ramban, who has a very different model of the interaction between the divine and the physical, still nonetheless doesn't see open miracles as a complete ideal. So the Rambam, who famously has a philosophical and scientific understanding of the world, believes that the world is designed to function in a certain sort of systematic manner, and therefore has a philosophical and conceptual concern about the concept of miracles, other than on perhaps very certain and rare occasions. The Ramban doesn't have that philosophical concern. Nonetheless, he still expresses this idea of miut nisim, of minimizing needless miracles. And therefore he says what Moshe did is absolutely appropriate. It's true they've been living in the Midbar till now, and in the Midbar, in the view of the Ramban, normal, natural existence wasn't possible. They had no choice. They had to be sustained miraculously. But now that they're about to conquer Eretz Yisrael, it's true Hashem has promised them military success. Nonetheless, it's appropriate for them to engage in hishtadlus, in their own military efforts and sending of spies in order to minimize the miracle. Why is this? Why, in the view of the Ramban, who again is not a Maimonidean, he's not coming from a Ramban perspective in principle, why is it that there's this concept of minimizing nisim and trying to avoid relying on the nace, needlessly relying on the miracle? I just wanted to use the time available to share 4 or 3, 4, we'll see what we have time for, perspectives on the matter, all coming from representatives of the school of thought, more of the Ramban and the Mekabalim than the philosophical school of the Rambam. So within that school, how do we understand this idea? And the first source I printed, I labeled as Drashot HaRan, the drashas of the Ran. The Ran was Rabbeinu Nissim ben Reuven. He was one of the early Spanish Rishonim. He lived from early 1300s to the late 1300s, 1315 to 1375 or the like. He was born in Barcelona, and he served as a Rosh Hashiva there, and was one of the leaders of Spanish Jewry. He wrote a halachic work, a commentary on the Gemara, and various other things. But he also gave drashas, and we have a collection of 13 of his drashas, 13 of his sermons in which he spoke. And in the drashas, he spoke as per the style of a sermon or a drasha, more philosophical or agadic matters and midrashic matters, rather than halachic discourse. By the way, these have been published as a collection known as Drashas Aran. And if anyone ever thinks their rabbi speaks too long when he gives a sermon, have a look at the length of these drashas. These drashas were given in a shul on a Shabbos, and they took at least 3 or 4 hours. You can see these are pages of voluminous notes. So a 10-minute drasha is getting away with it a little lightly. So anyway, the Ran in his drashas, in the 8th drasha, speaks about the subject, and I printed here just a very short extract from the page of the words of the Ran, and he says as follows: Shechefetz Hashem Yisparach, Hashem's desire is l'kayem minhagei shel olam b'chol mad efshar, to keep the world functioning in a natural manner as much as is possible. V'ashateva yokar be'enov lo yasigu ela l'sorech hachochi. The nature is precious in his eyes, and he won't alter it needlessly. So says the Ran in his quote of the. So says the Ran in his explanation of what the concept of minimizing miracles is. In other words, the Ramban is saying that the Ran, is saying that the nature in and of itself is precious to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why would nature be precious to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Because he created the world. Every miracle is a distortion of the natural function of the world. In the act of creating the world, Hashem looked at the world and he said, "Vayarikim ki tov." He saw that the world was good. The world was designed to operate in a certain manner, implanted with this style of operating from the moment of creation, and to express an idea that somehow the world leans on miracles, and without tweaking constantly and changing, it can't run effectively, is a destruction of the world. The world was created to be a good place. The world was created kitov because it was good. The idea that functionality is impossible, that it can't operate unless it is tweaked the whole time by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is a negative. This isn't the way things should really be. So the Ran is telling us that we shouldn't see a nace, we shouldn't see a miracle as fundamentally something positive. We should see a nace as an occasional necessity, of the truth reflecting a distortion of how the world ought to be, rather than an ideal of how the world should be. Rabbeinu Bechai, in his introduction to Shelach Lecha, says a different explanation of this. Rabbeinu Bechai is a generation after the previously mentioned names. He wrote a commentary on the Torah. There were 2 Rabbeinu Bechais, by the way. He's not to be confused with the author of the Chovas Levavos. And he wrote a sort of expanded version of earlier commentaries. And he says, "Ikar Yetziras Adam bonoi al midas hateva." The heart, the foundation of the creation of humanity, is built on nature. A person therefore has to act in a rational way in order to achieve his goals. So Rabbeinu Bechai says, look, not just like the Drashas Aran says that Hashem created the natural world because this is how he wants to be, because it's good, because this is the ideal, because constant tweaking unravels the act of creation. But more than that, we humans have to operate within creation. If we can't live in a rational system in which we're able to see what's going on, then how can we operate? We need to use the world as our tools to live, to flourish, to survive, to do things. If there was no regularity to the world, if any moment, today I throw a stone and it falls to the ground, and tomorrow I throw a stone and it floats up in the air, how can I know how to operate? How can I know what I'm doing? How can I make rational decisions and function in the world if I have no way of knowing what is happening and no way of predicting how the world is going to operate? So this is the point of Rabbeinu Bechai. The first point of the Ran is the world needs to operate in a natural manner. The second point of Rabbeinu Bechai is because that's the only way that human beings can function. The third idea comes from Yecheskel Levenstein, the famous pre- and post-war mashgiach, a student of Rabbi Zobin, the founder of the Muslim movement, who focuses on ethics and ethical development. And the idea, he says, is the danger in overt miracles is because it reduces human free will. Not like Rabbeinu Bachai says, because it means we can't function, because we don't have a rational universe within which we can operate, but because it shows us so openly and overtly the actions of Hashem, that it removes from us the possibility of making independent, freely willed decisions. Human beings were created not to be robotic, but to arrive at spiritual growth and insight through our own choices, through our own efforts, to mold ourselves and form ourselves into a certain type of character, to behave in a moral and spiritual manner. If we were so aware openly of Hashem's ability to intervene constantly with nature, we would cease to have meaningful free will. We'd be overwhelmed by the force of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be like an overly helpful parent who gives no space to their kids to mess up, no space to their kids to make decisions themselves. Every time a child tries to demonstrate initiative, the parent steps in and helps them. And mollycoddling in this way isn't a way of raising independent, freely choosing beings. And this, says Rav Chatzkel Levenstein, is the danger in Nissim. It mollycoddles us. It doesn't give us space to choose freely. We see it too overtly, HaKadosh Baruch Hu running the world, and therefore this isn't the manner through which the world operates. So these are three explanations as to why minimizing Nissim, miracles, is an ideal. Finally, we have the fourth explanation, which comes from the Ramban himself. And the Ramban at the end of Bo is discussing Yetzias Mitzrayim, the place of the Exodus in our theology, in our thinking. And the Ramban says there is a danger in miracles, because when you see a miracle, you can begin thinking that we live in a bifurcated world, a world in which, when the miracles happen, these are acts of God, these are spiritual moments of inspiration and insight, these are events in which we can read the course of history and see that which is good and that which is bad. But then we live the rest of our lives in a secular universe in which the world functions, onam kumin haganoig, the world functions in a systematic and regular manner, following the laws of science, and we think these are void of spiritual qualities. The purpose of miracles is to illuminate the non-miraculous, or the so-called non-miraculous, and to make us realize, therefore, every aspect of the natural function of the world has spirituality embedded in it, reveals the might, majesty, and greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and is, as much as the miracles, a revelation of the hand of Hashem in creation. So having the occasional overt miracle, especially in our infancy, at the founding of the Jewish people, the time of the Exodus from Egypt, served a function. But regular miracles, paradoxically, ironically, serve to undermine this function, because they need us to think that, yes, there's a time when Hashem intervenes in the world, and that these moments, the majesty and the strength of Hashem can be seen, and there's times of the world in which things are functioning naturally and distantly from that spirituality. And therefore, an overly overt miracle creates a bifurcation, a distance, a gap between the realm of the spiritual and the realm of the material, and this is counter to the plan of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who wants us to see in the natural spirituality, in the regular function of the world. He wants us to see his hands, he wants us to see his might, his power, his majesty, and the directionality of history and the morality embedded in it, as much as in the supernatural. So these are four approaches in the insight of the Ramban. The Ramban himself is coming from a disagreement with Rashi and the Malbim and that reading of it. The Ramban says nothing wrong with sending spies, who are indeed not scouts but spies, in with the mission of investigating how best to militarily conquer Eretz Yisrael. There's no lack of emunah and trust in Hashem. It's true, Hashem has said, I will give you the land of Canaan in your hands, but that's with the expectation that we will then minimize the miracle by taking action and responsibility ourselves. So this is a fascinating and important and illuminating idea that emerges from the opening section of the etc., the concept of sending spies, and therefore I call this Shiur Parsha Shelach Lecha, minimizing the supernatural. So we'll conclude here the Parsha section of the Shiur, and I would like to now switch to talking about the Bishul, the Melachos of Shabbos, and to revert to Hilchos Shabbos, to the Halachos of Shabbos. And we were in the middle of looking at cooking, and in particular looking at leaving food on the flame before Shabbos. And I had a vast number of questions, vast maybe is an exaggeration, but many questions that emerged after the previous share, where people spoke to me off group about what we had discussed. So I want to try and just really clarify this issue, because I think there's no area of Hilchos Shabbos about which there is as much confusion as around this point. So we discussed in previous week's Bishul, you can't cook on Shabbos. We're not going to go into that again. That's non-controversial. One isn't allowed to take food which is raw and cause it to become cooked or baked or fried on Shabbos. Equally, it is not controversial to say that before Shabbos, at least as far as Torah law is concerned, we can do what we want. The fact that I am setting into motion something which will have a result on Shabbos is not a Torah concern, as long as I've done it before Shabbos. And as long as it's not contrary to the spirit of Shabbos. There is a concept of Shabbosin, being in the spirit of Shabbos, what we call Shabbosdik, not uvda the chol, not weekday type activity. I'm not here talking about setting a time switch in order to allow one to watch the football match, which would be contrary to the spirit of Shabbos, but setting a time switch to have lights go on and off, lighting a candle before Shabbos so that you have light on Shabbos. These aren't problematic activities. On the contrary, these are reputable things to do. It's appropriate to light Shabbos candles before Shabbos, even though they will burn on Shabbos. There's no problem with things burning on Shabbos. There's a problem with my action of lighting on Shabbos. Similarly, having hot food on Shabbos is a good thing. And therefore, as far as Torah law is concerned, there should be no problem with putting a pot of raw food on the flame before Shabbos, such that it will cook and be ready on Shabbos to be eaten. However, D'Rabbanan, there is a prohibition of Shehiyah, of leaving food on the flame before Shabbos to cook on Shabbos in certain circumstances. Under certain circumstances, there is a rabbinic concern about leaving raw food on cooking. There are several other D'Rabbanans associated with Bishul. And for the ease of comprehension, and so that we don't feel overwhelmed by the halachas, in this year I'm simply focusing on this one aspect of leaving raw food cooking, heating itself up and becoming cooked on Shabbos, even though I did everything before Shabbos, the rabbinic prohibition of Shehiyah. There are many other rabbinic prohibitions, such as chazorah, putting things back onto the flame on Shabbos, and hatmana, insulating things on Shabbos. We're not going to talk about any of those because we will eventually, please God, in next week or the week after that. But for this week, we are simply focusing on leaving things cooking before Shabbos. And the reason why rabbinically one cannot leave food cooking before Shabbos is because the process of cooking is ongoing and constantly tweaks things and stirs things and raises and lowers the flame. And we're worried that in the process of cooking, the flame will be adjusted, and therefore leaving food, raw food cooking on Shabbos is a problem, because even though I did it, I put it on before Shabbos, I may tweak it on Shabbos and forget myself. Now, that's the Issa D'Rabbanan, and again, that's not a controversial matter. Equally, it's not controversial to say that if one has food which is completely and utterly cooked, that means to say the cooking process has come to an end, and it's what's called Mavushal Kol Sarko. It's completely cooked. Not only is it completely cooked in the sense that it's edible, but it's completely cooked that any further cooking won't improve it. It's not stomach v'yochelo. It's not edible, but by cooking further that it will become stronger and more softened or more tasty, but it's arrived at its best level. And indeed, any further cooking might even be stomach viralo. It will shrivel it rather than improving it. In that case, again, it is not controversial. Such a pot can be left on the flame before Shabbos with no other protection needed. Why is that not a concern? Because it's fully cooked, so you're not going to tweak it, you're simply warming it up. The concern is when you have food which is raw, because there you might tweak it. Now, this is the opinion of the Rabbanon. Chananya has an alternative opinion, and Chananya is of the opinion that as long as it's somewhat cooked, we call this machal ben drosoi, half cooked, a third cooked, it's just about edible, even though it's not fully edible. Nonetheless, once it's reached that state, you can leave it cooking on the flame on Shabbos, even without a blech, because it's basically cooked, it's edible enough, and therefore we're not worried that you will forget yourself and tweak the flame. So to summarize, completely raw food, no controversy about it. It can't be left on the flame in an open flame. Why not? Because you may tweak the flame. Completely cooked food, no controversy. It can be left on the flame because you won't tweak it, you're simply warming it up. Food which is partially cooked, edible but not fully cooked, is a machlokus between Chananya and the Rabbanon. As I mentioned last week, this runs through the generations. It remains a somewhat unresolved machlokus, and therefore, at least a chatchila, we don't leave partially cooked food on an open flame. However, b'diavad, if one is unable to cover the flame and the food is cooked sufficiently to be eaten, even though not ideal state of cooking, one can leave it on an uncovered flame. How do we avoid the problem of leaving raw food? How do we avoid the problem of getting into this debate about completely raw, partially raw, somewhat cooked, etc.? The answer is the Mishnah already tells us, if you remove the coals, or you, by sweeping them away, or you cover them with ashes, such that they're now covered, this is a sufficient reminder and a sufficient covering that we are not worried that you'll tweak the flame. And the modern equivalent of this is what used to be called a blech. I don't mean by that a hot plate, but I mean a sheet spread out covering the flame. And this is therefore best practice on Erev Shabbos. Always have one's flame covered, number one. And number two, always have food fully cooked. And therefore, the Chatzchila, in terms of kitchen protocol, we advise all food should be fully cooked and the flame should be fully covered, and you avoid any shilas. Why should the flame be covered? So as to avoid getting into the issue of what happens if the food's not fully cooked. Why should the food be fully cooked? So as to avoid issues of moving the food around on the blech from hotter places to colder places and colder places to hotter places, and therefore speeding up the cooking process to removing it, which could enter back into Torah transgression territory. So this is the concept of the old-fashioned blech, which covers the flame. We then mentioned last week the newfangled blech, the hot plate. And the reason the hot plate works is because it has two crucial features. It is unadjustable. It doesn't have a temperature dial. And number two, it's not normal to cook on it because it's unadjustable, because it's not something which has an easily tweaked heat, and the heat isn't very often isn't as strong as a regular heat. But even if it's very hot, it's not adjustable. It's not a normal way of cooking, and therefore this is akin to a covered flame. It can't be adjusted. It has no method of adjusting the heat level, and therefore again the rabbinic prohibition against leaving food cooking wouldn't apply. So I want to emphasize again, as far as core halacha is concerned, if I have fully cooked food, I don't need a blech. I can leave my flame uncovered because the food is fully cooked. There's no risk of tweaking the flame level. How would I need to use the food on Shabbos? I would leave the food on from before Shabbos, and on Shabbos I would remove the food, and that would be that. I wouldn't be able to put it back because the flame's uncovered, and next week when we look at the issues of returning things to heat sources, we'll look at that in more detail, but certainly the flame needs to be covered in order to return a pot to it. But I haven't transgressed the rabbinic prohibition against leaving food cooking because the food wasn't raw, it was cooked food before Shabbos, and therefore if it was fully cooked, it's not an issue. What happens if I don't have a blech and it's partially cooked? So again, as long as the food is edible, it's half cooked. Perhaps we measure half cooking by thinking about the total amount of time it needs cooking and then halving it. But roughly around half cooked or a third cooked, it becomes basic level of edibility. Again, we're not worried about tweaking the flame level, and b'diavad that would also be allowed, though best practice is even there to have a blech. So these are the concepts of a blech. A hot plate which doesn't cover the flame. You've got the natural heat source there, but because it's unadjustable, we're not bothered about it. And these are the classic solutions to how to leave food cooking on Erev Shabbos, either if it's fully cooked already, or if you're using a covered flame. If you don't have the option of covering the flame and you're stuck, you've run late, got caught in traffic, and you arrive in your holiday house and it's 10 minutes before Shabbos, and there's no way to get the food cooked, and you don't have your blech with you, and you're unable to cover the flame. What can you do in that situation? Well, if you're able to completely disable any ability to adjust the flame, you make it extraordinarily difficult to adjust the flame. That means to say you're not just covering the knobs or the dials on the flame, because the covering of the dials isn't enough. You need to cover the flame, as per our discussion last week, according to most opinions. If you're actually able to remove the knobs and lock them up in a cupboard so that there's no knob to make an adjustment. So you put the gas on the right level and then you can take off the knob, the plastic knob or something of the sort. Then according to the Chazon Ish and others, this would also be sufficient because you have turned even your open stovetop into an unadjustable heat source. Again, I want to emphasize, once you take things off, you wouldn't be able to put them back on because it's an open flame. And we'll discuss next week that Chazara, putting things back on a flame, can't be done onto an open flame. But leaving things on a flame, even though the flame is open, if it's literally unadjustable, wouldn't be included in the Takana Rabbanon according to most poskim, because it's unadjustable. The whole rationale behind the rabbinic prohibition was to avoid you accidentally adjusting, and you've made this unadjustable, you've made it impossible to adjust, and therefore, according to many poskim, this is okay. As we mentioned, if the food's completely cooked, again, there isn't a concern. And there's also the opposite scenario. When you have meat, which is completely raw, and it's a large chunk of meat, such that it won't become cooked over till the next morning, and overnight it will just cook by itself and it won't become edible at any stage. In that situation also, there is an allowance to leave it on an open flame, even though it's raw, because again, of the reverse, when you have a large quantity of raw meat, which needs to cook for hours upon hours upon hours, you don't tweak it the whole time, you just let it get on the job, you're not fussing over it. The fear of adjusting the flame was built around fussing over things. If you have something which is going to remain raw for hours on end, and won't be at all edible until the next day, this would also be okay. So the final exception for this halacha is if one's cooking a large chunk of raw meat, such that by reasonable assessment, it simply won't be edible till tomorrow morning, then again, the flame doesn't need to be covered. And for people using catering for large quantities, let's say you're making a simcha at home, a sheva brachas or a bar mitzvah or something like that, and you simply don't have enough lechs to go around, sometimes this is a relevant heter. Because the nuances are complicated, I would say if one ever needs to rely on this leniency, ask a shaila about the particular circumstance, but just for the sake of completeness, I mention it. So just to summarize, raw food can't be left before Shabbos because we're worrying about tweaking the flame. The natural and most normal solution is to cover the flame, or to have an unadjustable hot plate, which isn't a normal way of cooking. If the food is completely cooked, you don't need a blech. However, best practice is to have a blech and to have it completely cooked, and that way you avoid any shilas. And then there are rarer exceptions, like literally disabling it by removing the knob, not just covering it, but making it impossible to do without reattaching it, or at the opposite extreme where you have raw food, which is so raw that it's not going to cook for hours and hours, where again, we're not worried about constant tweaking. But these rarer scenarios probably should be addressed on a case-by-case basis through asking a shaila. I want to speak now about some of the other applications of this, though, some of the more complicated applications, which are common questions. And I want to speak about what features one should look for in a hot water urn, what features one should look for in a hot plate, and what features should one look for in a compliant oven. And these are the important halachas which don't fit neatly into anything we've spoken about. So features in a electric hot plate, as we already discussed, should be that they are unadjustable. They're not able to be adjusted, and that is sufficient for leaving food on them before Shabbos. Is it sufficient for chazorah, for putting food back onto them on Shabbos? That depends on the model of hot plate you have, and even if it is adjustable, and we'll speak about that next week. But all unadjustable hot plates are certainly okay for leaving food on Shabbos for them. So that's hot plates. All you need to do is check it's not adjustable. If it is adjustable, then it's like a regular stovetop, and it needs to, in addition, be covered with a blech, and you'll have to research the safety of covering your hot plate with a blech. What about hot water urns? What are the conditions with hot water urns? So again, a unadjustable hot water urn would appear to be okay. And I say it would appear to be okay because it's an interesting situation. It can't be adjusted. However, it is a perfectly normal way of heating water. Caterers and the like use hot water urns to heat water, even though they can't be adjusted. Nonetheless, even though it's a normal way of heating, since it can't be adjusted, it would appear that the drabanon, the rabbinic fear of adjusting flames when you're cooking, wouldn't apply, and therefore a non-adjustable water urn wouldn't be a problem to leave on before Shabbos with even cold water in it. If it has completely boiled water, then it's certainly okay because the water is boiled and it's non-adjustable, therefore there wouldn't be a problem at all. If the water is cold at the start of Shabbos, but the urn isn't adjustable, the rabbinic concern about heating water wouldn't apply because it's an unadjustable urn. Nonetheless, if you take water out of the urn before it has fully heated, you are speeding up the cooking of the rest of the water, and therefore there are potential problems there. So best practice is to have water heated fully before Shabbos in a non-adjustable urn. However, if the water is heated fully and it's an adjustable urn, or it's not heated fully and it's a non-adjustable urn, as far as core halacha is, it's okay. Now, as I said, you need to wait till the water is fully heated before you start taking water out of it. So this is the halacha in terms of the nature of the urn that you need to get. It ideally should be unadjustable. If it's an adjustable urn, it should be heated up fully before Shabbos. Now, there are a few other things, though, to mention around this. The first thing is some urns feature a Shabbos mode on them. Generally speaking, all the Shabbos mode does is disables the electric pump, which pumps the water out, but doesn't really do anything else to it. Some urns feature a Yom Tov mode. The concept of the Yom Tov mode basically is to alter the functioning of the thermostat to ensure that you can add cold water to your urn, and you won't trigger an electric the element coming on as you add cold water, and therefore in Yom Tov, when you can cook water, you can add water, cold water to the urn, and the urn can cook it, and it's not a concern. Basically, therefore, it disables or alters the working of the thermostat. I'm not going to go into the technical details now, in order to ensure that it's not a problem. If you have a regular urn and you're not sure how its thermostat works, then probably one should ask a shayla before Yom Tov about adding water, because it's possible that by adding water to it, you're triggering the thermostat. Though I have to say, in my experience, if you add a moderate amount of water, in other words, your urn is still half full of hot water, and then you add you fill it up an extra third or the like, I've never really seen ones which are problematic on Yom Tov. So I don't think the Yom Tov mode is really that necessary with unadjustable urns. In general, when you add cold water, if you literally flood it with cold water, of course the thermostat will turn the element on. But if it's still got a reasonable amount of hot water, it will not alter the thermostat instantly. There'll be a delayed reaction, and for technical reasons I'm not going to go into now, that isn't a concern on Yom Tov. So just to summarize what I've said so far, an adjustable urn should be heated fully before Shabbos. A non-adjustable urn, you can leave even non-heated water in before Shabbos, but best practice is to have the water fully heated before Shabbos so you don't have issues of taking the water out and causing the remaining water to cook more quickly. A Yom Tov mode is to do with the functioning of the thermostat, beyond the scope of the share, other than to say, in general, adding water on Yom Tov is not a problem with most models. Occasional models have a problem. They have lights, LED lights that are triggered and so on. Have a look at your model before you add water onto it for Shabbos. There's been a lot of discussion over the years with whether the little tube on the sides of the urn poses a problem with Shabbos use. Without going fully into the details, I'll just explain the question over here. On the side of an urn, there's very often a little plastic tube which is separate from the body of the urn, and it allows you to see and gauge the water level. It's a water level gauge. And the potential concerns that's been raised is that that water isn't heated by the urn. And as you take water out of the urn, you bring that water back into the urn and cause that water to get heated. Star K has very kindly done a large amount of research into this, in which they tested urns and they put dye into that little gauge to check how much water mingling occurs, and they measured the temperature of the water in the tube. And again, suffice it to say that there do not appear to be problems with this. So basically, most urns that are non-adjustable are okay, and there shouldn't be issues around this. And I think in terms of urns, that's all I'll say in the time available for us about urns. I wanted to talk now about ovens, because we are running out of time, except I've seen a couple of questions posted here. Bernard, so you posted this to everyone, so I can say this to Shem Omro. On Yom Tov, I put on a time switch to go off an hour in which to fill it up. That's certainly a good solution. That's a perfect solution, because you avoid all questions. You have your urn set to go on and off over Yom Tov, and during the time it goes off, you fill it up, and then there won't be any problem at all. That is correct. That's a very good solution. And someone else wrote to me, if one has a blech on the stove, can one put completely uncooked food in a pot before Shabbos on a stove which is covered with a blech? And the answer is yes. Completely raw food in a covered blech, on a covered gas light, covered with a metal sheet, is allowed. because completely raw. I'm not talking about the scenario of the large piece of meat or anything like that. You can, because it is covered. The only reason why it's, in other words, that is not what Chazal uttered. They said don't leave raw food cooking on an open flame. But if you have the flame covered, that's gorifikoton, that's the solution they gave, and therefore you won't adjust it, and therefore it would be allowed. The only reason why rabbinic practice is to generally advise people to food fully cooked before Shabbos is because even with the blech, if you start moving your pot around, then you can get into a mess. Because if you move it from a hotter part of the flame to a lower part of the flame, and it was raw when you left it on, then you're speeding up the cooking by moving it around. So as far as the core rabbinic core rabbinic rule of not leaving raw food on before Shabbos, if you have a blech covering it, that's sufficient. The only reason we advise to make sure food is always fully cooked before Shabbos is because if it's not, you can't move it around. But if you are running late and you have raw food and your flame is covered, you can put it on before Shabbos. Just make sure that you don't move it around. And once you take it off the flame, you can't put it back on because you might be increasing the cooking by so doing if it's not fully cooked. So this is covering a flame. I just want to talk about ovens very quickly. And this is really a longer topic. In fact, before Pesach, I was planning to give a dedicated share on what I call the Great Oven Scandal, and I would still like to give a share on the topic. But since we're now covering the topics here, the subject here, I'll just briefly mention the issue. Point number one: in the past, many had the practice to leave food in the oven from before Shabbos and take it out on Shabbos from the oven. Now, when would this be allowed and when wouldn't it be allowed? Well, the oven flame is uncovered if it's an old-fashioned gas oven. If it's an electric oven, the element is covered, but nonetheless, this is a normal way of using it. And even though the element is covered, it's a normal way of using it. It's adjustable. And therefore, in both these scenarios, the rabbinic prohibition against leaving food in uncovered flames should apply. Nonetheless, as we saw, if the food is fully cooked, you can leave it in an uncovered flame, and therefore many people had the practice of leaving food cooking in the oven, fully cooked in the oven. They would open the oven door on Shabbos and take the food out. What can't you do? You can't put the food back into the oven because it's an uncovered flame. But you can leave the food in as long as the food was fully cooked before Shabbos. Is there a concern with opening the oven door on Shabbos? Well, what would be the concern? That in the process of opening the door, you are lowering the temperature in the oven and therefore triggering the thermostat to increase the heat level of the oven. And in the past, it was well known that this wasn't an issue because it was quite an indirect manner of causation. You opened the door, cold air came flooding in, there was a delayed reaction, the thermostats were quite chunky until they caused the element to switch back on. And therefore it was indirect causation without particular interest in the result happening. Certainly once you've taken the food out, you don't care that the temperature will go up, and therefore this was allowed. In more recent times, things have become more complicated on several levels. First of all, they've become more complicated because it's become more common for the opening of the door to directly trigger a change. How would opening the door trigger a change? It would turn a light on and off, which you can see. It would turn a fan on and off, which you could hear. And it would turn the elements sometimes on and off, which you might be completely oblivious to because you can't see and can't hear. So by opening, closing the door, we're not in the realm of indirectly triggering through air rushes changes happening. You're directly triggering something through the change happening. And therefore companies installed a Shabbat mode, which turns off these changes. It turns off the element, turns off the light, and turns off the fan. Oh, sorry, not turn them off, but stop the door having an effect on the light, the element, and the fan. Now, if a Shabbat mode is done properly, in very brief, it stops the fan, the light, and the element. You're back to the old situation of being allowed to leave fully cooked hot food in the oven and take it out once, but not return it. However, it does not allow one to leave raw food in the oven, and it does not allow one to return food to the oven. Why not? Because it's still a normal oven, which is a normal way of cooking. It's true the Shabbat mode might also stop you being able to change the temperature, but it's simply a one-click press to turn the Shabbat mode off, and then to be able to change the temperatures. It's still fundamentally an adjustable heating source, and therefore all the Shabbat mode does is allow you to leave food in and not return it, and not leave raw food in but only cooked food. It still remains an open flame, just as long as the food is fully cooked, you can leave food in, but you can't return it. So this is point number one, that even with a good Shabbat mode, it just allows you to do fully cooked food in, nothing else. The second point is that unfortunately it's come to light that a lot of the companies didn't understand what the Shabbat mode was, and all they did was disable the fan and the light, but they didn't disable the elements from going on and off as you open and close the oven door. And therefore, when you open and close the oven door, the things you can see, it doesn't affect the light, it doesn't affect the fan by opening and closing the oven door, but it still turns the elements on and off. And for this reason, one needs to check when one gets an oven about the reliability of the oven mode. Sometimes one can check the model number, and the Federation, Rabbi Zobin and FedTech in particular, have done quite a lot of research into the matter. And the truth is, you can check yourself also. You can see as you open and close the door if your electricity consumption shoots up and down, and you can hear a click even of the elements turning on and off. But in general, the information is that until recently, nefs were thought to be okay, but as of May 2020, Nef and Bosch and Siemens, BSH, may be non-Shabbos compliant despite their claim to have a Shabbos mode. And even before May 20, many of the other non-Nef companies, their Shabbat mode was not Shabbos compliant despite their claims because they haven't understood what a Shabbat mode really meant. So we've run out of time now, so I'm going to stop there. And this is a little summary about the oven issues. In brief, to summarize what we've said about ovens, ovens are open flames. Based upon what we've learned, one can't leave raw food there. One can only leave fully cooked food in the oven, and one can't return food to the oven because they are still open, uncovered flames. All the Shabbat mode does, if it works, and if it's a good Shabbat mode, it removes modern day problems of the oven door opening and closing, triggering fan, light, and element going on and off. And with that, we have finished what I'm going to say for now about Shehiyah. Next week, we will look at Chazorah, which is returning things, putting things onto the flame on Shabbos. We'll move away from Erev Shabbos to Shabbos itself. And once we've done that, we will revisit hot plates again, and we will revisit crock pots and slow cookers and various other devices. But for that, we're going to wait till we do putting things on the flame on Shabbos rather than leaving things on the flame from Erev Shabbos. I wish you all a good Shabbos, but that's not what I meant to say. I wish you all a good evening. And as always, thank you so much for joining, and I'm happy just to hang around for a few minutes to take questions if there are any.